fields around Besford do not immediately suggest the kind of place where dark stories survive. It lies quietly in the Worcestershire countryside, not far from the Severn Plain, surrounded by farmland, narrow lanes and low ground that has been worked for centuries. There are no dramatic ruins here, no castle walls or abandoned abbeys dominating the landscape. The village is small, restrained and easily overlooked. Yet places like this often preserve older memories more stubbornly than larger towns ever could, because the land changes slowly. The stories remain attached to it long after the people involved have disappeared. Church Farm stands near the centre of Besford's older history. Like many farms in rural Worcestershire, it was not simply a house with surrounding land, but part of a working agricultural landscape shaped over generations. The fields, boundaries and tracks around it developed gradually over centuries, altered by ownership, farming practice and the changing needs of the parish. Archaeologically, the area reflects the long continuity of rural settlement across the Severn Basin, where medieval farming patterns survived well into the modern period. Even today, much of the surrounding landscape still follows older boundaries, laid out long before modern roads cut through the countryside. One part of the land became known locally as Dog Kennel Place, a name tied to the keeping of foxhounds. The owners of Church Farm were once responsible for kennelling dogs used by the local hunt, and for generations the area retained that association. It is an ordinary enough detail within the history of rural England. Hunting shaped much of the countryside socially as well as economically, particularly among wealthier landowners, and kennels were common features on estates connected to local hunts. Yet at Besford, the memory attached to those kennels became something darker. The story appears to have circulated for well over a century and was still being repeated in the 20th century. According to a local tradition, sometime during the 18th century, the kennelman at Church Farm was woken during the night by disturbance among the hounds. Something had unsettled them badly enough for him to leave the house and investigate. What happened afterwards belongs firmly to folklore rather than documented history, but the tale remained remarkably consistent. The dogs, so it was said, turned upon him in the darkness and killed him. By the morning, very little remained. The detail most often repeated was that only his boots were left behind, still containing his feet and lower legs. Everything else had supposedly been torn apart or devoured by the hounds themselves. It is a brutal image, and perhaps because of that, the story endured. Rural folklore often survives through vivid fragments, rather than elaborate storytelling, and the image of those boots clearly rooted itself deeply enough in local memory to pass between generations. Afterwards, people began speaking of sounds heard crossing Dog Kennel Place after dark. Not sightings, at least not usually. The story centered, instead, on footsteps. Heavy boots moving across the ground where no person could be seen. Some versions mention the faint jingling of spurs accompanying them, suggesting the dead kennelman was still walking the same route he had crossed on the night he died. Like many old countryside traditions, the story became stronger through repetition rather than evidence. No contemporary 18th century account survives confirming the event itself, and it is important to separate the folklore from the verifiable history. Yet stories do not persist for centuries without attaching themselves to real places and real anxieties. In rural communities where work with animals could be dangerous and isolation was part of daily life, such tales reflected genuine fears as much as ghost belief. What gave the Besford story fresh life was a discovery made much later. In 1930, human remains were uncovered at Church Farm. Reports at the time noted that one skeleton appeared to be incomplete, lacking its lower legs. Almost immediately, people connected the discovery to the old story of the kennelman. To many locally, it seemed like confirmation that the tale had been rooted in truth all along. Later interpretation, however, suggested something more historically grounded. The remains found at Church Farm, along with others uncovered nearby, were likely connected to the English Civil War and the fighting surrounding the Battle of Worcester in 1651. The countryside around Worcester saw troop movements, retreat, skirmishing, and burial activity during the final stages of the conflict, and isolated remains are not unexpected in the region. Missing limbs or incomplete skeletons are also far from unusual in archaeological discoveries, particularly where graves have been disturbed by agriculture over long periods of time. Still, once folklore absorbs a discovery like that, it becomes almost impossible to separate one from the other in local memory. The Besford story also sits within a wider tradition of dangerous or supernatural hounds found throughout English folklore. In some cases, these tales become highly supernatural, involving spectral black dogs or infernal hunting packs. At Besford, however, the story remains unusually grounded. The horror comes not from anything demonic, but from something painfully physical and believable. Dogs bred for hunting are powerful animals, and rural folklore has always understood how quickly control can disappear under the wrong circumstances. A similar story was once told at Broadway, not many miles away, involving another kennelman, said to have been killed by his hounds after going outside during the night wearing only a nightshirt. According to that tradition, the dogs failed to recognise him in the darkness and attacked him. Afterwards, people claimed to see a pale figure walking near the kennels at night. Whether the Broadway story influenced the one at Besford, or whether both grew independently from older fears surrounding hunting dogs and isolation, is difficult to say. What matters more is how such stories survive. Even now, Dog Kennel Place remains one of those names that immediately invites explanation. The landscape itself appears calm and ordinary, but the story attached to it changes the way people imagine the ground. A field becomes a location with memory. A path becomes somewhere associated with footsteps in the dark. And perhaps that is why the tale endured for so long. Not because people truly believed a pair of ghostly boots wandered the fields at night, but because the image itself captured something ancient and unsettling about the countryside. The isolation, the darkness beyond lamplight, the dependence people once had upon the animals they could never fully control. In places like Besford, history and folklore often sit unusually close together. Civil War dead beneath the soil, hunting traditions fading into memory, stories passed quietly through generations until no one remembers exactly where they began. And somewhere among all of that remains the old image that refused to disappear. Not a ghostly figure standing in a doorway, not some dramatic apparition in the night, only the sounds of boots crossing a dark field where no living man should be walking anymore. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the podcast and get access to MP3s over on Buy Me a Coffee. They're £1.50 each, or free if you're a member. You can also find everything at ghosttales.co.uk and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Ghost Tales Podcast.